The town that forgot itself. It began with the lights. Not the flickering you might get from a faulty bulb or a storm coming in, but a slow, deliberate pulse. Every night at exactly 10:13 p.m., the street lights along Oakwood Drive would dim and glow like a dying heartbeat. The first few nights, people in the small New England town of Hadley chalked it up to some quirk in the electrical grid. It was old town after all, built long before wires and poles snaked across the landscape. By the end of the week, though, the lights were the least of their concerns. Hadley wasn't the kind of place where much happened. The biggest story in recent memory had been when old Miss Carrow's cat got stuck in the church belfry for 3 days. But when Janine Coates disappeared, people started locking their doors. She'd been last seen jogging near the woods on the edge of town. The police combed through the forest, but all they found was her sneaker. Just one. The other was never recovered. A few days later, Roy Harker, the town's mailman, vanished during his morning route. His truck was discovered idling at the corner of Pine and Willow, letters still in their slots. The engine purred softly, but Roy might as well have been swallowed by the earth. People whispered, of course. Small towns thrive on whispers. Some said it was a serial killer. Others blamed wild animals. But the oldest among them, the ones who remembered Hadley before the new developments, before the gas station and the strip mall, they said nothing. They just locked their doors and stared at the pulsing lights, their faces pale as moonlight. By the second week, the air in Hadley seemed different, thicker somehow. It carried a metallic tang that clung to the back of your throat. Birds stopped singing, and the forest at the edge of town grew eerily silent. Even the dogs, Hadley had plenty of dogs, wouldn't go near the woods. They'd whimper and tug at their leashes, tails tucked between their legs. Then the dreams started. Nearly everyone in Hadley began waking up drenched in sweat, their hearts hammering. They dreamed of shadows moving through the streets, of voices whispering in a language that didn't belong to this world. The dreams always ended the same way, with the sound of a child crying, sharp and brittle, like glass shattering. On the third Saturday after the lights began their pulse, the town's annual harvest festival was cancelled. The mayor said it was out of respect for the missing, but everyone knew the truth. No one wanted to be outside after dark. The pulse had grown stronger by then, the dimming and glowing casting the streets in a sickly rhythm. It wasn't just the street lights anymore. House lights flickered too, and even candles seemed to sway to the same invisible beat. It was around this time that Emma Grayson found the diary. Emma was 14, a quiet girl with a knack for sneaking into places she shouldn't be. She'd been poking around the old Bellingham house, a creaky, abandoned relic that most kids avoided. It had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, but Emma liked the way it smelled of rot and secrets. The diary was hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the upstairs bedroom. Its cover was cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. The writing inside was spidery, almost illegible, but Emma could make out enough to understand one thing. Whoever wrote it knew something about the lights and the disappearances. One entry dated August 14th, 1937, read, "They come when the town forgets, when the roots are severed and the old ways are left to rot. They feed on the gaps, on the spaces where memory fails." Another, dated October 31st, 1937. "We tried to stop them, but it was too late. The harvest was already taken. Now we're just echoes, shadows of ourselves. God help anyone who stirs them again. Emma read the diary cover to cover that night, her hands trembling. By the time she finished, the pulse of the lights seemed to sync with her own heartbeat, and she realized something terrifying. Hadley hadn't just forgotten something. It had forgotten itself. And whatever lived in that void of forgetting was waking up. Emma didn't tell anyone about the diary. Not her parents, who were too busy arguing over whether they should move to her aunt's house in Albany, and not her best friend Claire, who had stopped replying to texts 2 days ago. She thought about taking it to the police, but what could they do with something so old and cryptic? Instead, she returned to the Bellingham house the next day, clutching a flashlight and a notebook. The air inside was colder than it should have been, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something coppery. She searched for more clues, poking through drawers, peeling back wallpaper, and checking every loose floorboard. In the basement, she found something she hadn't noticed before. A mural painted on the far wall, hidden behind a stack of rotting crates. The image was crude but chilling. Figures with blank faces, long limbs, and fingers like claws, standing in a circle around what looked like a pulsing red light. Beneath it, words were scrawled in faded black paint. We tried to hold them. We failed. A shiver ran down Emma's spine as she backed away from the mural. The air seemed heavier down there, pressing against her chest, and the light from her flashlight flickered. She thought she heard a whisper, soft, almost too faint to catch. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, and strained to listen. The whisper came again, louder this time, but still in that strange, alien language she'd heard in her dreams. She ran. She didn't stop until she was back home, locking her bedroom door behind her. She threw the diary onto her desk and stared at it, her mind racing. That night, the dreams were worse. The shadows weren't just moving through the streets. They were inside her house, sliding under the doors and creeping along the walls. The crying child was louder too, and this time, Emma could see her. A little girl in a tattered white dress, her eyes wide with terror. She held out her hand and whispered something Emma couldn't understand. When Emma woke up, she found a smear of red dust on her windowsill. It glowed faintly in the morning light, and when she touched it, her fingers tingled. Somehow, she knew this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. By the next morning, Hadley felt like a ghost town. Fewer people walked the streets, and those who did moved quickly, their heads down. The pulse of the lights was stronger now, casting an eerie rhythm that seemed to thrum in Emma's chest even when she wasn't near them. Emma decided to confront Claire. She couldn't shake the feeling that her friend's silence was tied to everything happening in Hadley. She biked over to Claire's house, her heart pounding as she rang the doorbell. It echoed too loudly in the quiet morning air. Claire's mother answered, her face pale and drawn. "She's not feeling well," she said, clutching the doorframe like it was the only thing holding her up. "She's been in bed for days. Fever dreams." Emma's stomach twisted. "Can I see her? Please?" Reluctantly, Claire's mother led Emma upstairs. The air grew heavier with each step, and when Emma pushed open the door to Claire's room, a wave of cold air hit her. Claire was lying in bed, her face pale and slick with sweat. Her eyes fluttered open when Emma approached. "They're coming," she whispered. Her voice cracked and dry. "I saw them. In my dreams. They're already here." Emma sat beside her, gripping her hand. "What are you talking about? Who's coming?" Claire's gaze shifted to the window, her eyes wide with fear. "The shadows, they're everywhere, and they want us to remember." Before Emma could ask what that meant, Claire convulsed, her back arching off the bed as she let out a strangled cry. Her mother burst into the room, but Emma was already backing away, her heart racing. The lights in the room flickered wildly, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw a shadow move across the wall. A shadow that didn't belong to anyone in the room. She fled, pedaling her bike as fast as she could back to the Bellingham house. If there were answers, they had to be there. She threw open the front door and sprinted to the basement, the mural looming in the dim light of her flashlight. The whispering started again, louder this time. Emma pressed her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't just around her. They were inside her head. She stared at the mural, her eyes drawn to the pulsing red light in its center. It seemed to move, to throb in time with her own heartbeat. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a single voice spoke, low and guttural, in a language Emma didn't understand, but somehow she knew exactly what it meant. "Remember us." The voice lingered in Emma's mind long after it stopped. It felt like an echo trapped in her skull, growing louder with every passing second. She stumbled out of the Bellingham house, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and collapsed on the overgrown lawn. The sun was setting, and the pulsing lights of Hadley were already beginning their nightly rhythm. Her head throbbed as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The diary's cryptic warnings, the mural, Claire's feverish whispers. It all pointed to something ancient, something forgotten. And whatever it was waking up. Back home, Emma flipped through the diary again, desperate for her answers. The spidery handwriting seemed more legible now, as if the words were rearranging themselves to reveal their secrets. One passage caught her eye. "The red dust marks the veil. It is the edge of their world and ours. Cross it, and you will see what lies beneath. But beware. Once seen, it cannot be unseen." Emma shuddered, her fingers brushing the faint smear of red dust still clinging to her windowsill. The memory of the tingling sensation it left on her skin returned, sharper now. Was this dust the same eerie glow she'd seen in the mural? What the diary referred to? She had to know more. Her first thought was the library. Hadley's library was one of the oldest buildings in town, its archives packed with records going back centuries. If there was anything about the town's history that could explain the diary or the strange occurrences, it would be there. Emma grabbed her backpack, stuffed the diary inside, and set off on her bike. The library was nearly empty, its silence amplifying the rhythmic pulse of the lights outside. Emma headed straight for the archives in the basement, where the air was musty and the light dim. Rows of ancient ledgers, yellowing newspapers, and forgotten books lined the shelves. She focused on anything related to the year 1937, the date mentioned in the diary. Hours passed as she sifted through brittle pages and faded ink. Most of what she found was mundane: crop yields, social gatherings, births, and deaths. But then she stumbled across a thin leather-bound volume labeled Hadley Records, October 1937. Inside, one entry stood out: October 15th, 1937. A peculiar incident was reported near the woods on the town's northern edge. Locals spoke of a red mist rising from the ground, accompanied by strange lights and whispers. Several residents complained of vivid dreams and headaches. By the end of the month, 7 people had vanished without a trace. The incidents were dismissed as hysteria, and no formal investigation was conducted. Emma's heart raced. The pattern matched what was happening now. She turned the page, her hands trembling, and found a chilling note scrawled in the margin. They forgot, and it spared the town. But memory is a dangerous thing. Once stirred, it demands to be fed. The air in the basement seemed to grow colder as Emma closed the book. The lights overhead flickered, and for a moment, she thought she heard the whispering again. She turned, her pulse quickening, but the basement was empty. She bolted up the stairs, the diary and town record clutched tightly to her chest. As she stepped outside, the night air hit her like a wall, thick with the metallic tang she'd come to dread. The lights pulsed stronger now, casting distorted shadows that seemed to ripple like water. Emma pedaled home as fast as she could, the whispers following her every turn. When she finally reached her house, she slammed the door shut and locked it, her chest heaving. She knew one thing for certain now. The veil between Hadley and whatever lay beneath had been broken, and it was hungry for more. As she sat in her room, staring at the diary, a new thought clawed its way into her mind. If the town had forgotten before, could she make it forget again? Could she find a way to close the veil before it consumed them all? But the whispers in her head grew louder, as if answering her question. One word echoed louder than the rest, sharp and final. No. Emma didn't sleep that night. The whispers clawed at the edges of her mind, their guttural tones impossible to drown out. The diary lay open on her desk, its pages splayed as if begging to be read again, but Emma couldn't bear to touch it. The weight of its warnings felt like a stone in her chest. As dawn broke, painting the town in pale gray light, Emma knew she couldn't face this alone. She needed help, someone who understood Hadley's history better than anyone else. Her first thought was Mr. Fincher, the town's reclusive historian. His house sat on the outskirts of Hadley, an ancient Victorian swallowed by ivy and decay. Emma biked there, her heart pounding as she approached the sagging front porch. She knocked twice, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still morning air. The door creaked open, revealing Mr. Fincher's gaunt figure. His eyes, sharp and gray, locked onto Emma's with an intensity that made her step back. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. Emma nodded. "I found this." She held up the diary, her hands trembling. Fincher's eyes widened as he took it from her. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing darker with each passing word. Finally, he closed it and looked at her. "This is bad," he murmured. "Very bad. You've stirred something ancient, something that feeds on what we've tried to forget." He motioned for her to follow him inside. The air inside Fincher's home was heavy with the scent of old paper and dust. His study was a chaotic maze of books, maps, and faded photographs. He sat down in a worn armchair, his bony hands steepled beneath his chin. "What you found," he began, "is a record of what the town buried. The veil between our world and theirs was sealed long ago, but it was fragile, tied to the town's collective memory. When people forget, the seal holds, but when someone remembers..." He gestured to the diary. "This happens." Emma swallowed hard. "How do we stop it?" Fincher sighed, his shoulders slumping. The seal can be reforged, but it requires sacrifice. The veil is anchored by memory, and memory demands a price. He rummaged through a stack of books, pulling out a faded tome bound in cracked leather. Opening it to a page filled with strange symbols, he pointed to an illustration of a glowing red circle surrounded by shadowy figures. The harvest ritual, he said. It binds the veil by offering something the town holds dear, something irreplaceable. Emma's stomach churned. What kind of sacrifice? Fincher's gaze darkened. A life. The words hit Emma like a blow. She stumbled back, shaking her head. There has to be another way. Fincher didn't reply. Instead, he handed her the tome. Take this. Study it. If you're serious about saving this town, you'll find the strength to do what needs to be done. By the time Emma left Fincher's house, the streets of Hadley were nearly empty. The few people she saw moved like shadows, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. The pulsing lights had grown brighter, their rhythm faster, more frantic. At home, Emma locked herself in her room. The tome and the diary spread out before her. She pored over the ancient text, her fingers tracing the jagged symbols. The ritual was clear. To seal the veil, a life must be given willingly, and the sacrifice must take place at the site where the veil was torn. Her mind raced. Who could she ask to make such a sacrifice? Who would willingly give their life to save a town that was already falling apart? Then a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if the sacrifice didn't have to be willing? She pushed the idea away, horrified, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. That night the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. The shadows moved closer, their clawed fingers reaching for her. The child in the white dress stood before her wide eyes filled with tears. They're coming, the girl whispered, and they'll take us all if you don't stop them. Emma woke with a start, her cheeks wet with tears. The whispers were louder now, filling her room like a chorus of despair. She knew she was running out of time. She had to make a choice. The next morning, Emma packed her backpack with the tome, the diary, and a flashlight. She pedaled to the edge of the woods, where the red dust seemed to thicken, glowing faintly in the morning light. As she stepped into the forest, the air grew colder, the whispers louder. The trees loomed like twisted sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. She followed the trail to the old clearing where the mural had been painted in the basement of the Bellingham house. Here, the ground pulsed faintly, as if alive. The red dust coated everything, and the air shimmered with an unnatural energy. Emma opened the tome, her hands trembling. She read the ritual's incantation aloud, her voice shaking. As the final words left her lips, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The shadows emerged from the trees, their faceless forms circling her. Their whispers grew deafening, but Emma stood her ground. "Take me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If that's what it takes, take me." The shadows paused, their movements slowing. One stepped closer, its clawed hand reaching out, but instead of taking her, it pointed to the diary in her hands. Emma hesitated, then opened the diary to the final page. The spidery handwriting had changed, the letters rearranging themselves before her eyes. The price must be paid, but the choice is yours. Emma's heart pounded. The shadows closed in, their faceless voids waiting for her decision. And in that moment, Emma realized the terrible truth. No matter what she chose, there would be no going back. The only question was how much she was willing to lose to save a town that had already forgotten itself. Emma sat in her room, the tome and diary open before her. The whispers no longer came and went. They were a constant drone, like static at the edge of her hearing. She knew the town was running out of time. The veil was tearing wider, and the shadows were no longer content to linger in the periphery. They were coming. She traced her fingers over the faded illustration in the tome. The glowing red circle surrounded by faceless figures. The harvest ritual, the one thing that might seal the veil, required a life. But whose? The words burned in her mind, sharp and cruel. The choice is yours. The air outside was thick with tension, the pulsing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls of her room. Emma's hands trembled as she flipped to the final page of the diary. The spidery handwriting shifted again, rearranging itself into a message that hadn't been there before. To forget is to survive. To remember is to fight. Choose wisely. Emma felt a chill creep down her spine. The shadows were pressing against the edges of her vision now, shifting and writhing like smoke. She knew she couldn't delay any longer. The town's fate rested on her shoulders, and every second she hesitated brought them closer to destruction. The clearing in the woods was bathed in a faint red glow, the ground coated in the strange, luminous dust. Emma's flashlight flickered as she stepped into the center, the diary and tome clutched tightly to her chest. The air was colder here, heavier, and the whispers were deafening. She placed the tome on the ground and opened it to the page detailing the ritual. The symbols seemed to pulse with life, their jagged shapes almost writhing on the page. Emma's voice shook as she began to chant the incantation, the ancient words unfamiliar on her tongue. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the red glow intensified. The shadows emerged from the trees, their faceless forms circling her. They moved in unison, their clawed hands reaching toward the center of the clearing. Emma's heart pounded as she finished the chant, her voice rising above the cacophony of whispers. The shadows stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, one of them stepped forward, its form towering over her. It extended a hand, long and thin, and pointed to the diary in her hands. Emma hesitated, her breath caught in her throat. She opened the diary one last time, and the words on the final page glowed with an eerie light. The price must be paid, but the memory must remain. Emma realized what it meant. The veil could only be sealed if someone willingly gave their life, but their memory had to endure. The town couldn't forget again. It would mean living with the pain, the knowledge of what had been lost, but it would also mean survival. Emma's mind raced. Who could she ask to make such a sacrifice? Who would willingly give themselves to save the town? She thought of Claire, pale and feverish in her bed. She thought of her parents arguing about leaving Hadley. She thought of herself. The shadows waited, their forms shifting and restless. Emma's hands clenched into fists. She knew what she had to do. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Take me," she said, "but leave the town. Let them remember." The shadows moved closer, their whispers rising to a crescendo. The largest one extended its hand again, and Emma felt a wave of cold wash over her as she reached out to touch it. The moment their forms connected, a blinding light erupted from the center of the clearing, and Emma's world went dark. When the sun rose over Hadley the next morning, the town was eerily quiet. The pulsing lights were gone, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. People emerged from their homes, their faces pale but their eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. The red dust that had coated the edges of the woods had vanished, leaving only the faintest trace of its glow. In the center of the clearing, where the red light had pulsed, there was now only a small blackened circle of earth. The shadows were gone, and the whispers had faded. But the memory of what had happened remained. Claire awoke in her bed, her fever broken. She stared out the window at the morning light, a strange sense of calm settling over her. She didn't know why, but she felt like she'd lost something important, something she couldn't name. The town moved on, as towns do, but the people of Hadley never forgot the lights, the disappearances, or the whispers in the dark. And though they didn't speak of it often, they all remembered the girl who had vanished the night the lights stopped pulsing. Her name was Emma, and she had saved them all. Some nights when the wind was just right, the people of Hadley thought they could hear whispers at the edge of the woods, and they would pause, shiver, and hold their loved ones a little closer, grateful for the memory of the girl who had chosen to remember.